What's up, you guys? So a while back, I made a video on how I use org for my note-taking using a tool called Vim, as well as configuring NeoVim with Lisp using Fennel. Those are easily the two biggest selling points of Emacs, Emacs Lisp and org mode, so it makes a lot of sense that people would want me to take a look at both those tools. So I figured worst case scenario, I end up with a pretty good video topic and I get to try and learn Emacs, so why not? Those of you with a keen eye may have noticed that I was actually using EXWM, which is an Emacs window manager, when I was making my video on configuring NeoVim in Fennel. So there was a bit of a hint there earlier for those of you guys that were interested to see what my next video would be. So yeah, I actually have been using Emacs for quite a while now, actually. There's a bit more to the reasons why I decided to take a look at Emacs again, but just to get a bit further on into the video, I'm just going to go over some of the topics that we're going to cover in it. So in this video, I'm going to be explaining why I'm trying Emacs. It goes a bit more in depth than what I explained earlier. There's a lot more to it. I also wanted to give my thoughts on Doom and Spacemacs because I personally don't actually use either of them or any pre-configured distro. I decided to do it this time just starting from scratch because there aren't too many people that have actually done that, have a YouTube channel, and are willing to talk about it. So I figured that would put me in a pretty unique situation, especially considering that most of the guys doing those sort of videos aren't exactly people coming from a, fairly Vim focused background. I also wanted to talk a bit about how long it would take for somebody to get comfortable in Emacs. For me, it wasn't too long, but we'll get a bit more into the details of that further on in the video. Next, I wanted to give you guys some tips for those of you interested in actually learning Emacs. For those of you coming from a Vim background, I'll go over some terminology and just some general tips that may help you guys get started. And finally, I kind of wanted to talk a bit about, should you even learn Emacs? Is there really a point? Is there not a point? And I'll cover that at the very end of the video before I say goodbye. Now, I'm going to avoid talking too much about my personal configuration because I will do a follow-up video going in depth into each of the different parts of my configuration at this current point in time, which will help you guys, at least if you're trying to catch up to the point that I'm at. This should give you a pretty good starting point. A few things probably won't be necessary, but I think it would be a pretty interesting video, and I'm sure a lot of you guys would like to see it. Now, when it comes to what actually got me to try Emacs, there's quite a few different things, and some of them come from some issues I had from Vim, but a lot of them come from just the way I saw the community headed. This might be worth its own video, so I won't go too in depth on the topic, but my main thoughts are that Vim's big draw for me was actually that it was opinionated. You see, Vim had a very small tool set, and because of that, it caused you to use your operating system more and take advantage of that and build less things into the editor itself. And when you did build something into the editor, it was usually based around its core tools. This was really popular if you guys have ever used pretty much any of Tim Pope's plugins. They pretty much all take full advantage of the built-in systems in Vim. Now, with NeoVim, this didn't really seem to be happening so much. NeoVim seemed to be kind of leading a lot of people into the direction of just re-implementing everything. You see, I'm sure there's like hundreds of different picker programs, and a lot of different plugins have decided to just opt into you actually building your own picker system rather than, say, for example, the quick fix menu or the confirm function, which also is a very simple way to confirm and decide how you want to do things. So because of that, we kind of just ended up in this weird situation where everyone's just recreating the same things over and over again rather than using what's built into Vim. Now, while that's just NeoVim that's really going in that direction, you can also see that Vim is also not really heading in a direction that I think is really going to benefit everybody. There's been a lot of talk about breaking backwards compatibility, which I found was one of the really cool selling points of Vim, as well as Vim 9 seems to be pretty performant, but also seems to change a lot of the fundamental features. And because of that, I don't really think anyone's going to be adopting it. And it's just going to start forking things more and more and more because NeoVim becomes very different from Vim itself over time. Now, that said, I'm not trying to spread shame on either of these projects. They're both great projects. They just don't really seem to be headed in a direction that I think I'm interested in. I'll talk a bit more about why this actually led me to specifically Emacs in just a sec. First, I want to talk about what actually got me to give Emacs specifically a try, because really, NeoVim was doing a good job. NeoVim was perfect for me for text editing, but there was one sort of drawback. You see, I write my emails with Mutt. I really like Mutt. It's really great. NeoMutt's also cool. I just used Mutt because it's default and it had a Lisp feature built in. And you know me by now that I'm kind of interested whenever I see Lisp things getting added somewhere. You see, now while I liked using Mutt, and I found it really nice for writing my emails, it allowed me to use Vim for actually editing them, I found that I had a hard time automating some of my email respondents. A lot of the times I maybe wanted to give a somewhat prepackaged response and something that would be a bit more of a response using a snippet. And so that's kind of what I did with NeoVim, but I found like crossing back and forth between Mutt and NeoVim really annoying. I was pretty much just doing it all from NeoVim because Mutt doesn't really expose these abilities to extend it this way. As a result, I ended up actually leaving Mutt and going to what's called MBlaze, which is a purely command line interface. Maybe if you guys are interested in it, I will do a video on it. It's a really nice way to break up how you actually use your email, basically. It allows you to do basically these small little commands, kind of filter, sort, collect your email all in a bunch of different ways. And then I also used recall, which is very similar to not much. In fact, they use the same database system. I'm not going to go too in depth onto these specific tools because it's not the point of the video, but it basically gave me this way to grab, search, filter, get all this information from my emails, as well as respond and prepackage responses a bit more effectively from Vim and the command line. Eventually, this started becoming a bit of a hassle, and I still had issues with things like being able to automate checking my emails when I send them. There's a few different ways that I could have done that, but I never really found any of them to really grab me or really work that great. And so because of that, I felt like I was just kind of missing something, and I wanted a way to simplify things and kind of optimize this workflow. Then I realized that this problem that I've been having has been solved for quite a long time from Emacs. Emacs has actually had a very similar workflow to this with MU4E, which is basically something similar to Not Much, as well as acting a bit more like an interface than Not Much would. And as a result, you get a very powerful search interface and a way to manage multiple email addresses, because I work with 3 different email addresses. I have 2 work and 1 of my personal. So I like to be able to work between them, and I don't want to accidentally be sending emails to somebody from work and send it from my personal account. That's not very professional. And luckily, MU4E basically does all this out of the box as I would expect. I also found it a lot nicer to be able to actually mark important emails and actually take notes on them using org mode, which was really powerful. Maybe I'll cover this in a future video, but it's a very nice workflow to have when you can basically integrate your to-do lists with your email, which I find really helpful for my current job. So because of this and the other videos that I talked about where I found some of these other features of Emacs really interesting, I figured I should really give it a try. And for those of you thinking to yourselves, yes, that's correct. I didn't switch to Emacs for the text editor or anything like that. I switched to it because I wanted an email client. That's not really the only reason I've been using it, and that's not the only thing I've been using it for. But I just kind of find that interesting that that's the one thing that really sold me on it. Now I'm going to get a bit more into the actual positives and reasons that I really like Emacs and I've been sticking with it for so long. So the first one I wanted to talk about is that it's a fully text-based interface, and because of that, that means that you pretty much can do everything that you'd ever want from scripting or using Emacs Lisp, because you're not having to do queries on a database, you're not having to maybe pull apart some file or use some external command to interface with everything. Pretty much everything in Emacs is done with text, which is great. Except you still get some of those nice GUI features when you need them, like images and pulling up windows, all that sort of stuff. Next up is that it's an integrated system. And so what I mean by that is that nearly every package exposes an API that you can interface with, which I find really powerful. This is what I loved about tools like FCF. I didn't really use FCF in particular for reasons basically related to the architecture of Vim, because FCF still couldn't really integrate that well with Vim. I ended up pretty much never using it because of the fact that I just found that it wasn't very well integrated. But it itself gave a lot of opportunities for other plugins to integrate with it. And this is also replicated in Emacs. Now, the APIs that Emacs itself actually exposes are pretty much everything in the editor. You can do as much as you could really imagine. And this is a pretty good example right here. I'm just going to open up another window, and you'll notice that there is just one status bar down here. Now, the status bars in Emacs are known as mode lines. And often if you open up a lot of splits like this, you'll end up with a lot of status bars. Now, in this case, I don't have them. I just have these little lines. But if I just run mini mode line mode, it will add these little mode lines back in. Now, this is where the power actually comes in, because instead of having all these replicated mode lines, I can just go ahead and remove them using a package. A package is basically a plugin if you guys are used to Vim. This is basically just all done with a plugin, and it is able to do a fundamental UI change that I find really convenient because, especially since right now I actually use Emacs as my window manager, you'll notice that it takes up a lot of space. If I go back to that, you'll see that it does take up a decent amount of space, and as you open more and more of them, it can get annoying. So I prefer to have them hidden and puts them right down here. My mode lines aren't actually the same because I don't use the default mode line configuration, but you can go ahead and do that anyways. So yeah, it's pretty powerful, pretty cool. And that's just one example. Another example would be completions. So normally when you guys are in Vim, you can like hit E and you'll type like, I don't know, some file, and you want to edit a file. If I hit tab, you can actually use a plugin called, or package called Vertigo, which will actually offer me these complex completions. And these completions are actually the system built into Emacs. Vertigo is just a user interface for them. So these completions are available in a bunch of different ways. You don't have to have them purposefully built for this, versus with something like FZF, you wouldn't even really be able to replicate this. You'd really be like doing FZF, and then FZF would go from there. And then you'd have to work through FZF's interface, which isn't really what I would like to do. Now, like I said before, it can take advantage of GUI features. Like for example, it has this nice little symbol up here. This probably could have been done though with just Unicode, but a lot of stuff like bigger font sizes, which I don't take advantage of, can be done with this. If you look down here, my status bar actually is a completely different size from this text, and I can make it smaller and bigger and open up another window. Let's just open this. I can change my font size without affecting it. That can be pretty convenient. That can be useful, as well as being able to have symbols. Like down here, I have my system tray built into Emacs, all sorts of stuff. So those are some of the nice GUI features that you get from it. Now, just for the purpose of this video, I'm gonna go ahead and actually turn on the mode line just so you guys can see what I'm typing. All right, so anyways, so to continue on, another pro besides the GUI features is Emacs Lisp. Emacs Lisp is great. I'm sure you guys have heard this plenty of times. It's not perfect by any means. It doesn't have namespaces. It doesn't have a lot of programming language features that a lot of people would like to see. Supposedly those are coming soon, but it's pretty powerful, as well as having native compilation coming pretty soon. So you'll be able to run this at binary level speeds soon enough. It should be out in the next version of Emacs, which was another big thing that kind of kept me interested, because while Lua can be quick, I can't imagine that really will be beating, like I can't imagine they're really going to be that different on speed at that point. As well as I just really believe that there's a lot more potential in the Emacs Lisp community. The Lua community is still relatively small. Like NeoVim has improved its size, but most NeoVim plugins are just replicate what someone else did in Vimscript and make it worse. So no offense to any of you Lua plugin developers, that's not everybody, but that's what a lot of them are. Now, for some of the cons that I've come across in Emacs, one of them is it pushes you away from a command line workflow, which I kind of miss as somebody that was pretty used to working with command line tools. A lot of them don't really work very well. And so you're kind of just better off using more of like a simple interface and less ncurses tools, because ncurses tools don't work in any of the built-in Emacs command lines. But there are still command line tools that work really well with it. In fact, I often use eShell as my actual shell of choice. And eShell is really nice because you can do things like ls and get all these directories, and you can actually move around pretty comfortably with it. You can like yank as you'd expect, all that sort of stuff. So pretty convenient. Now, if I jump back, I can move around pretty quickly in it as well, compared to what you would expect if you had, I don't know how many different things I have open, but I have a lot of things open and I'm still able to navigate it pretty quick and jump back and forth between them. So that's one of the benefits that you also get. Now, another negative is that you actually end up wrapping a lot of command line programs because of this interface. That being said, though, Emacs is actually pretty good at wrapping these sort of tools. There's a lot of different ways to interface with things, and I'm actually making a small script to basically use Emacs's ability to run a little server in the background. That way, when you get a message in, so for example, if I have a command line going and I want to tell Emacs to complete something for me, I can go ahead and use Emacs client to tell it to do that. And then that way I can actually replace dmenu and use that tool instead of dmenu, and then get a much more integrated environment on top of that. Not that I really mind using dmenu, I just kind of thought it would be a fun little tool to mix in there. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about my experiences with Emacs. So when it comes to learning Emacs, there was actually quite a few times that I gave it a try, and it never really worked out. The first time I actually tried Spacemacs after watching this pretty popular video from a Vim conference. Let me just open that up. And it's just going to start playing any second now, but I will link it down in the description. There it is. I'm not going to make you guys sit through it, but he talks a lot about evil mode and how you can basically get productive in Emacs and why you should use it. Although, as I started giving Spacemacs a try, the features that he talks about in the video are pretty much being replaced and added into Vim. So I kind of didn't really see as much of a selling point, as well as I had quite a few issues with Spacemacs. I found it to be really complicated and over-engineered. I found that I really had a hard time understanding what was going on because it just added so much on top of Emacs, as well as basically anything I looked up about Emacs usually wasn't related to Spacemacs. That's a lot less common now. Now a lot of people are using Spacemacs or Doom Emacs, so there is that benefit there. They also added a lot of UI features that I really wasn't interested in, and they added so much and kind of tried to hide things from me. It felt like I was never really completely in control. I was just hoping that they weren't completely destroying my dev environment. So as a result, I kind of didn't really want to stick with them. I'm the type of person that likes to be really in control, and I totally get why they're designed that way. They're intended for people that aren't really used to programming, that don't really have much knowledge on Emacs. They're meant to basically just have you get set up and go. That being said, I still don't really know if it makes that much sense considering that they are basically wrappers around evil mode as well, because in the end, they still are focused on people that are using evil mode bindings. I don't know. I didn't end up finding any of them very intriguing. It kind of just felt like I was using VS Code or any other IDE like text editor, which is like cool, but that's not really what I want. I want something that allows me to hack on it. And while those tools did kind of let you do that, it wasn't really what I was looking for. So as a result, I ended up going back to Vim. Now, eventually, once again, like I mentioned before, after all those issues and things that kind of made me want to try Emacs, I decided to give my most recent attempt a go. I decided to go bare bones, no Emacs distro, or any of that sort of stuff. I just went clean slate and I wrote my config from scratch using a few different resources as well as the official documentation, which I found really helpful. And I actually have a few places that I'd recommend that you guys take a look at. I've been using it for about a month now, and I've replicated 90% of what I would hope to get out of my workflow. My workflow is obviously very different from what it was like in Vim, but because of the actual setup of Emacs, it wasn't too difficult to replicate a lot of the features. For example, asynchronous make is just built in. I'm not having to build it myself like I did with Vim. There's a bunch of different tools for it in Vim. I just decided to do it myself because I didn't really find any of them really was as minimal as I would like. Now, for those of you guys at home that are like, you said you've only been using it for a month, you obviously have no idea how to use Emacs then, because DistroTube said it takes 6 months. I don't think that's very reasonable. I think if you guys are pretty proficient with Vim, then the transition is actually pretty straightforward. It can be a bit intimidating, but as long as you're giving it a go and you're actually willing to learn, it goes a long way. I think the biggest thing that slows down your learning is using one of those distros. I think if you're interested in seeing the power that Emacs has, then giving one of those distros a try is a good option. But if you want to actually learn it, I don't know. Maybe you could eventually. I'm sure you probably could eventually. If you look through all the documentation, I'm sure you'll eventually learn it all. But I can't imagine trying to learn some of the more lower level conceptual features that you often end up needing to know in order to understand why you would use a certain package. Otherwise, you're kind of just hoping that you're doing everything the way it's intended. You're kind of using terms and you're not too sure where they come from. And it kind of just ends up making debugging as well as asking for help or getting inspiration from other people. It makes all that stuff a lot harder, as well as I personally just prefer to be a bit more, in the nitty gritty of things. Now, it's not to throw shade on anybody that does use those tools. I think those tools like Doom Emacs and Spacemacs are both really interesting Emacs distributions, and I think they are worth like giving a bit of attention because they do provide a lot of great things. Tons of people use the Doom mode line, and a bunch of different tools from Doom have been integrated elsewhere. That's not so common with Spacemacs, and I think Doom has really done a good job at introducing people to more of Emacs than Spacemacs really did. Spacemacs tried to wrap way too much of it, in my opinion. But that being said, I haven't been around that long. I've only been using it for a month, so take that with a grain of salt. I still have plenty to learn from Emacs. There's quite a few different things that I found really interesting. I've been trying to make sure that I know all the built-in packages, get comfortable using registers because registers are much more powerful in Emacs than they are in Vim, in my personal opinion. They're just a bit more integrated. I find that while they are used in a lot of places in Vim, like they're used for recording macros, they're used for clipboard management a lot of the time, I find like registers I just don't really feel much of a use in. Versus with Emacs, you can do some really cool and really powerful things with them. Using registers in macros can give you a really interesting counter feature, which I'm sure you could also do in Vim somehow. I'm not really too sure how, but I'm sure someone's figured out a really good way to do it. I think you guys are probably pretty confident with Vim. If you guys are a fairly advanced Vim user, you can probably get comfortable in less than a month. I'll be putting out videos related to Emacs probably semi-regularly. I'll still be doing videos on Vim because I really don't know if I'm completely sold on it. I do think I will probably incorporate Emacs in some way into my daily workflow. If anything, it'll probably take over my major use of Vim. I still don't really know if I like some of the other features, but I'll get into that when we talk about my configuration in a future video. Now, for those of you guys that are actually interested in learning Emacs, I have some pretty good resources that I'd recommend. I'd say taking a look at Protesilaos, I think is how you pronounce it, and System Crafter's YouTube channels, I'll link them down in the description, are really great. If I actually just open this up, you'll see that they have some pretty interesting stuff. I can't recommend Protesilaos or Prot enough. His videos have been super helpful for me. He does a lot of videos a bit more focused on tools that aren't used very often that come built into Emacs, and I love that sort of stuff. That's my sort of thing. If you guys are used to Greg Harrell, I think is how you pronounce it, I think was what his name was, he does Vim videos. This is very similar to that. He does very somewhat power user related videos. They're not quite as much as Greg, but I think it's pretty similar. So if you guys are used to those videos and you enjoy them, definitely check out his channel. And on top of that, if we take a look at System Crafters, he does a lot of live streams. Really good guy. I recommend his Discord if you guys use Discord. There's also the Emacs IRC that you can look at too, but both channels are really great. Now, I just wanted to go over some quick terminology that may confuse you guys. So frames are pretty much windows. Frames can be used different from different tools. I've noticed that frames in EXWM actually open as a different workspace. But usually when things are referring to a frame, they're referring to just a window. Buffers work pretty much the same as they do in Vim. You guys actually, let's just go ahead and open a terminal, and I can actually just, let's open up some stuff. Let's just open up a couple of files. All right, and then I can do ls in Vim and it will list out my buffers. Buffers are basically just an instance of a file that's in memory. So for example, if I change this file, so I've made some changes to it, these changes are not actually affecting the file. The buffer is what's containing it. So the buffer is just whatever text is being contained. And this works pretty much the same in Emacs. So right here, this is a buffer. If I don't save what I do and I delete that, then this is just done within the buffer. Buffers are a lot more prominent in Emacs. That's actually how I navigate EXWM. And yeah, so if I go back to YouTube, we can get a bit more into buffers maybe in a future video, but it's a pretty simple concept if you guys understand it from Vim. If you don't understand it from Vim, take a look at the help, and it will simplify things a bit more when you guys try out Emacs. Mode line. Mode line is basically your status line in Emacs. Pretty straightforward. It's just that bar down here, like I mentioned before. So this is just the mode line, this thing that's flashing down here. And then there's packages. Packages are just plugins, like I mentioned before. Packages, instead of using external package manager like you would with Vim, or not package manager, but plugin manager. So example would be Vim plug is what a lot of people like to use. There's a bunch of different ones out there. A lot of people just use package.el. It's pretty straightforward. You can actually do list packages, and it will list out all the packages that you have available. So here's just a bunch of ones that I have available. It also tells you like ones that are built in, tells you dependencies. Yep, that's right. The package management in Emacs actually handles dependencies. Versus in Vim, I feel like everybody just avoids dependencies like the plague, because it is a huge headache to tell the person to individually get all these plugins installed, and often they're not really worth it because there aren't really libraries for Vim, but that's becoming a lot more popular with Lua. Anyways, so going on past this, there is the mini buffer. The mini buffer is what is down here. So right below the mode line, you'll see there's this little section down here. And if I click down there, it will show all these messages, right? So down here, messages. But the mini buffer is basically anything. So if I do MX, this will give me a bunch of options. So down here, this is considered still the mini buffer. It's everything that's below that mode line. And so I can select like a command to run, like list packages is what I just did. Another time that you'd use it is if you're using evil mode. If you hit : it will also pull you into the mini buffer. Or if I do mini mode line, that's pulling the mode line into the mini buffer. That's kind of how it works. Really cool. You get a lot of interesting stuff. It also gives you a little echo information down here. So I can just turn that back off and we'll get the echo information down here, and it will show you just a quick little outline. If you're using, if you're programming eLisp, it'll give you documentation, all that sort of stuff. Anyways, that's enough about the mini buffer. Sorry, I went a bit crazy there. Now, another one that actually confuses a lot of people is modes. This actually did confuse me at first because the way that they explain it is so broad, but I think it makes a lot more sense when you compare it to Vim. A major mode is really just a file type. If you guys are used to file types in Vim with syntax highlighting and FT plugins, then that's basically what a mode is. You can only have one enabled at a time, as you'd expect, because you can only have one file type. There is ways to work around that, but that's kind of like the idea of it. You can do compound file types, but we're not going to worry about that. Major mode is basically just a file type. Now, a minor mode is kind of more like a feature. So a good example of that would be like Match It or any of those sort of smaller packages that are enabled at all times, or maybe when it would highlight parentheses that match each other, any feature like that, or maybe cursor column or anything like that in Vim. A minor mode is very similar to that. So there's a bunch of different minor modes, and you can have multiple enabled at once. So some that I mentioned here is company. Company is used for completion, so and then you'll see that I have all these completion options and I can tab through all of them. The company can be enabled, but I can also have show paren on. So if I have some parentheses, it will still highlight them. So those two features are enabled at the same time. There's not really too much to really worry about. Okay, so that's basically all minor mode is. A minor mode is just a feature. It'll start to make a bit more sense. Another example would be folding. Folding, there's a bunch of different kinds of folding that you can have, and so you'd enable a mode for that kind of folding that you would like. Pretty simple. I already mentioned these YouTube channels that I recommend taking a look at. Go ahead and check them out. I highly recommend it. Now, some other things that I highly recommend you take a look at would be actually understanding the help. Help in Vim is very straightforward. You pretty much just do help and then whatever you're looking for. It's not quite as straightforward with Emacs. There's a bunch of different help commands. If you do just Control H, it will give you a big list of different things. The big one you're usually looking for is Control HF. This will list out a bunch of functions. So we can go ahead and do mini, since we were just talking about this, mode line mode. There it is. All right, so mini mode line mode, basically that's just a function. And so every command that you use in Emacs is actually just a function. So this right here is just a function. They have a special little parameter on them that tells them that they're interactive and that they can be used on the command line, or with meta X, I guess. Meta X is just alt X. So that's how you can look at functions. Now we can do Control HK, and this will prompt us to hit a key. So when I do Control HK, it will ask me what key I want to look up, and we'll do Control K. So Control HK, and then hitting Control K again will give me information. So it says Control K runs the command kill line. Now you'll notice that basically every single key is actually bound to a function. So that's pretty much one of the big things that's actually really nice. It kind of seems like that in Vim, but it really isn't, because a lot of things are just bound to that key, and that's just kind of how they work. So you end up just mapping keys to other keys instead of functions, which has its own drawbacks, and it's not very clear what does what. So there's that. But we can go a bit further with this. Let me just close this up. Now, if I do Control HM, this will give me information on all the minor modes that I have enabled. Let's just control that. So if I open up a minor mode, so if I do Control H, it will give me all those modes. And so I have auto composition, blah, blah, blah. You'll see I have evil, I have evil collection, evil commentary, evil, all the evil modes are all minor modes because obviously you don't want to have evil mode enabled when you can't have a file type enabled. And on top of that, it gives you all the key bindings in this modes. This is really helpful. For example, if you guys are interested in playing around with Magit, maybe you want to learn some of the key bindings, that's pretty helpful. Or maybe another one, let's do buffer. If I open up iBuffer, I'm probably gonna be like, what the heck is this? How do I use it? If I just do Control HM, it will give me all the information I need to understand what's going on in iBuffer. So pretty straightforward. Well, we can talk more about this in a future video. I just kind of wanted to give you guys some examples of how you can use the help. There's a bunch of other stuff. You can also do Control HA, and this will allow you to use regex to just search for a word in the help. That's another option. Oh, Control HI is also very useful. It takes you to info, and a lot of different things have info entries. So for example, AFI, Corfu, Vertigo has it. Emacs itself is actually entered in info, and you can go in there and you can jump through all the info, like, oh, like keys. I want to know the keys. Can hit enter and it will give me a bit of a rundown on the keys. You kind of get the idea. Just going a bit further, let's just narrow down on this. Now we're going to talk about my key points of my configuration. Now, like I said before, I'm going to keep the actual explanation of my entire configuration for its own dedicated video. So if that interests you guys, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you guys get notified when it happens. Now, some other key points about my workflow that I figured I should go over is that I am using EXWM, which is a window manager. Yep, that's right. I'm using Emacs in my window manager. Ha ha ha. Everybody thinks it's a joke, but it actually is really nice. Like being able to manage all of this. So like now I can like sort by mode and then EX. Now I can see like, oh, all my actual X windows and kill them as I need to. Gives me a pretty nice workflow. I'll talk a bit more. I'll probably give EXWM its own dedicated video because I've learned a lot from it and there's some really interesting stuff you can do with it. Just a really quick demo for you. If I open a bunch of windows, so I've got like 3 windows open. Now I can actually go ahead and just close them. So let's close this guy, close this guy. All right, and now we only have 1 window open. Now I can do an undo using a mode called winner mode, and it can actually undo those changes to the windows. So if I'm jumping around in windows, then I can jump all the way back to where I just was. All right, so pretty useful to be able to undo closing and opening windows. Now another one I use is Vertigo. Vertigo is my completion interface. This is how I'm kind of jumping around. If I disable, so Vertigo mode, if I disable Vertigo mode and I hit Meta X, it will just not give me any pop-up. And I can do vert it, and then I have to hit tab and everything like that. All right, and I've enabled it again. Sorry, that was kind of awkward. I think I must have spelled something wrong the first time, but that's kind of the idea of it. So it gives you a nice little interface instead of having to basically have what you have in Vim where you're just typing normally blindly and then you're hitting tab. Now with Vertigo, I can just hit tab and it will give me this nice completion interface. So pretty cool. Another option that's really popular is Ivy. Ivy works very differently from Vertigo. Ivy is like an actual completion framework of its own. Vertigo integrates with Emacs's own completion interface, so that's kind of the big difference. Another thing that's a key point in my workflow is evil mode, as well as evil collection. Now, eventually I plan to kind of cut down on my usage of evil features and try and use some more of the basic built-in Emacs features and more use evil as a way to edit text rather than as my full-on interface, because I kind of wanted to simplify things a bit more, get more comfortable with the defaults and cut down on extensive configuration. Evil collection's nice, but it's not really, like, it's nice for integrating with a bunch of different tools, but it's not perfect. Now, while Emacs is great, it definitely isn't for everyone. Prot, one of the YouTubers that I mentioned before, put it best when he said that Emacs isn't for tourists. It isn't exactly the most welcoming thing when you go into it. It takes a lot of time to be dedicated to it, to start to learn it. And then once you start to learn it, you kind of want to start putting your workflow towards Emacs in order to make the most of it. Otherwise, you're not really going to get the most out of your time. But that being said, you don't have to dedicate all your time to Emacs. Emacs can just be a text editor. But at that point, I do think people make a good point when they say that Vim is the better text editor. Vim is the better text editor. Evil is nice, but I think like all of Emacs's built-in features aren't really that much nicer than Vim's, and in some cases they're worse. So as a result, I find that you're definitely probably better off just sticking with Vim if that interests you and all you want is a text editor. But I do think there's a lot that Emacs offers that a lot of people aren't talking about. Many of you would also be better off with one of the Emacs distros. If you just kind of want something pretty straightforward, you can just pick it up and start programming in whatever language you're used to, then one of those distros might be a good choice for you. I personally think that if you're not willing to put in the time to learn Emacs, then it's not really worth using one of the distros. You should probably just use Vim and go from there. Vim definitely has a lot less of a learning curve. I wouldn't really say, like after you're comfortable in Vim, I think you can pretty much switch to Emacs pretty easily. Like the actual, obviously VimL is very different and all that sort of stuff, but I do think it's not as bad as people make it out to be. Now I'd like to get a bit more into the actual benefits of Emacs, but at this point the video is getting pretty long, so I should probably cut it off here. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about them in the future. A big one is EXWM. I think that's probably one of the biggest selling points that you'd never expect EXWM to be as great as it is, but it is. It is really great. And I'll talk a bit more about why I chose to use EXWM, maybe in that future video too. Anyways, guys, I hope you found this video interesting. I'd like to thank my patrons, DFDX, Brian Jenks, and I actually got a one-time donation. But I'd also like to thank, if any of you guys are interested in chatting with me or would like to talk to me, be sure to throw a comment down below with suggestions. Once again, I'm new to Emacs still. I've only been using it for a month now, so there's plenty that I have to learn. So be sure to throw comments down below with suggestions. And if you guys would like to chat, hit me up on Discord. I'm very active. I'll have that link down below as well. All the links down below. Anyways, guys, I hope you had a great time, and I'd love to chat with you guys in the future. Anyways, see ya.